and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. It's the 10th of October at 10 p.m. So 10:10 at 10. And we're talking budget 2026 tabled just hours ago in the Dewan Rakyat. Now the numbers are out and the real test begins. What did this budget get right and where did it fall short? And what exactly does it reveal about the Madani government's priorities? Joining me on the line now is Intan Nadia Jalil, Regional Head of Group Economic and Market Analysis at CIMB Berhad. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me on a Friday evening post-budget. So let's talk about Budget 2026. It's full of goodies galore. What are some of your initial reactions to the allocations in Budget 2026? Was there anything specific that stood out to you?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks so much for having me. I think with regards to the budget, there's always, for me, two things that we need to consider, right? The budget always has to be contextualized within the general or the overall institutional policy framework for the government itself. I mean, it's just one tool. And sometimes I think we tend to overestimate its importance. I'm always sort of amused but also encouraged by the interest that the budget holds for everyone. Every single nation will always be excited over the budget. I mean, compare that with our counterparts in the oligarchic United States of America, where, the fact that the budget fails to get any Congress approval means that the government has effectively stopped. But in comparison, their reactions are sort of very muted, and their interest in their own budget is actually very muted compared to ours. But also, like I said, we have to remember that the budget is just one tool in an arsenal of tools that the government has to employ. And it basically, very speaking, outlines the annual allocation, the yearly allocation for the government. And it needs to be supported within a strong and robust institutional governance framework, as Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has always emphasized. With the Madani economy, it's about raising the ceiling, raising the floor, but also it has to be on the foundation of good governance. I think that's where we have to look at, that's how we have to look at the budget. So with regard to your questions in terms of what stood out, I think several things stood out. I'd like to bucket it in terms of, the welcomed, the needs more details and needs more work, and slightly bemusing. I think in terms of the welcomed measures, apart from the continuing focus on ensuring the continuation of social welfare programs, as well as the cash transfers and the STR and SARA, that actually takes cognizance of the impact of a challenging external environment, chief of which is possibly when it comes to hitting the Rakyat's pockets and mitigating the impact of rising prices. That's one. Two is really, I think the syntaxes were quite welcome. And actually, the commitment to actually use the additional revenue to the syntaxes directly for MOH initiatives, which were a welcome measure. I think the 10% allocation, the 10% imposition of alcohol tax. I do wonder though whether the imposition of the tax on cigarettes also includes a taxation on vapes. That would be interesting to see, right? And again, when it comes to the budget, we'll have to look beyond the headline numbers themselves. And speaking of the headline numbers, there are questions with regards to what is the actual government expenditure allocation, because in the budget speech, Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, mentioned that it was 470 billion ringgit. But upon further perusal of the budget speech, that also includes items beyond what we traditionally define as government expenditure, i.e. operational expenditure and development expenditure, because the 470 billion includes investments from GLCs as well as public-private investments, which are traditionally not really included when you want to calculate the government deficit. So I think perhaps this is the signal that the government is trying to signal its commitment to continued fiscal responsibility, whilst not sacrificing welfare and social welfare concerns.
Nadia, could you explain, sorry if I may interrupt, could you explain the difference? So we have, as you said, the headline number of 470 billion ringgit. Using that headline number is an expansionary budget. But if we were to drill down to the details of 419.2 billion ringgit, talk to me a little bit about, as you mentioned, the government's fiscal responsibility in keeping the level of spending in check. Is it appropriate for Malaysia's current fiscal position? Is this a fiscally responsible budget?
I think taken into, if we're looking at an amount of 419 billion ringgit as compared to 450 billion ringgit last year, against a projected revenue of, I think it was 390 billion compared to 380 billion. I'm not sure, but I think there was a 10 billion increase in projected revenue against a projected increase of 20 billion in terms of, if you're just comparing between the 470 billion against the 452 billion last year. But if you're talking about, if you're just looking at definitions and looking at the 419 billion, then it would seem as if it is actually more, I would say on balance, it looks like a more fiscally responsible budget. That is still expansionary, because expansionary, remember, means that the budget is in deficit. So every deficit means it's an expansionary budget as opposed to contractionary, right? But in terms of total amount, strictly speaking, it does estimate a reduction in terms of direct, I would say, government expenditure in terms of operational and development expenditure. So I think what the government is trying to do here is trying to explore additional sources of funds that may be utilized for public use. But then this, of course, implies that there's going to be, or rather this, of course, means that there's going to be good governance involved in the implementation of those programs. I did say just now, I left out a amusing item within the budget itself. I think some of us were looking askance at the addition of the airport, I believe, in UHCM, which is a maritime university. I think that we would like to see further details on that.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out. But can I just look at, so this budget really indicates what the government's economic priorities are for the next year. But what does this budget indicate to you about the government's view of the economy and the wider economy for the following year? Because I'm looking at the projections for Petronas dividends. It looks like the government appears to be anticipating a tougher year ahead for Petronas with lower oil prices. The dividends are significantly lower, 37% drop, if I'm not mistaken. What do you make of this, Nadia, in terms of how the government sees the temperature for the economy next year?
I think that's a perfectly realistic view of particularly the external challenges that the Malaysian economy faces. Really, we're looking at a highly unpredictable global economy because it's still being led by an unpredictable government. It's being led by an unpredictable person. And really, I think markets and business as a whole are still in waiting mode to see what further changes and what further dramatic changes will happen before they commit more investment. So it's really taking into account that we're going to see a more muted economic growth globally next year. We might see delayed supply side challenges when it comes to the effects of these tariffs, because I really believe that the full impact of these tariffs have yet to come online, because we don't quite know what the full impact on supply chains are because of the lags in production and planning, right? So I think it's quite a realistic view to expect there to be a reduction in oil dividends, given that, you know, oil prices are driven highly by demand, and OPEC so far has been committed to stabilizing supply. I think in that sense, yes, it's quite realistic. I do, however, would like to know where the government sees the other economic drivers are going to be next year, given the 4.5% projected GDP growth, because, you know, our markets still see growth next year, given all the challenges, to be between 4.1 to about 4.3%. I mean, it does. I mean, there is only, you would say, a 20 basis point difference, but, you know, we're talking about hundreds of billions here.
Yeah, there seems to be optimistic projection for economic growth momentum for next year. Can I ask you, based on this budget 2026, how do you think the business community might react to it? You talked a little bit about the uncertain investment environment at the moment, the investment climate at the moment, but has this budget 2026 gone far enough to temper some of those anxieties?
We will have to see how Bursa opens on Monday morning. But in general, I would say that the budget has not contained any drastic surprises for the business and investment credit of the government itself. That they've managed to communicate an adherence to fiscal reforms that shows in the budget. And I guess we'd like to see more details in terms of what line items are actually going to be reduced going forward. But on the whole, the signal really is that this is a fiscally responsible government that still tries to maintain the well-being of its people, but also taking into account a more challenging external environment and the need to be fiscally responsible given a situation or environment of higher interest rates perhaps and higher debt service charges.
Right. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me on the show late on your Friday evening. I know it's been a long day for economists everywhere, but thank you for your time and your insights there. Intan Nadia Jalil from CIMB Berhad. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more on Budget 2026 in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This.
Huawei kembali mencuri tumpuan peminat teknologi dengan pelancaran siri Huawei Watch GT6 yang menawarkan hayat bateri sehingga 21 hari. Model Huawei GT6 dan GT6 Pro menampilkan pemantauan kesihatan bertingkat, lebih 100 mod sukan serta ciri baharu untuk larian dan berbasikal. GT6 Pro turut dilengkapi badan alloy titanium dan kaca sapphire, sokongan mod sukan seperti golf serta fungsi ECG untuk pemantauan jantung. Bagi siri GT6 pula menyokong aplikasi harian termasuk pembayaran QR TNG, akses NFC waktu solat dan My Border Pass terus di pergelangan tangan. Pertembahan dibuka sehingga 3 Oktober dengan harga bermula RM999 dan hadiah percuma sehingga RM446. Di samping itu, Huawei turut memperkenalkan Huawei Watch Ultimate 2 dengan keupayaan selaman sehingga 150 meter. Pertembahannya juga kini dibuka sehingga 14 Oktober pada harga serendah RM3,499 dengan hadiah percuma bernilai sehingga RM1,305.
Febreze baharu dengan 2 kali wangian untuk wangian yang memikat setiap hari dan setiap malam. Nikmatilah wangian Febreze yang menakjubkan.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada.
Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. If you've just joined us, we're discussing Budget 2026, which of course was tabled in Rakyat earlier today. Joining me on the line now is Aira Azhari, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the think tank Ideas Malaysia. Aira, thank you again for joining me on a Friday evening. I know lots of people have had a very long day of watching the budget tabling and digesting some of the allocations that have come out. But what were your initial reactions to the budget? Can I ask you what it reflects to you about the Madani government's economic priorities for the coming year?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that the allocation, the budget this year is less than the last tabled budget by 1.8 billion ringgit. I think it's been a while since we've seen a reduction. I think the last time was during the COVID years. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see a leaner budget. But I think a leaner budget is good in some ways, but I think what maybe was missing a bit was, fiscal policies that can adapt to the changing economic environment. As we all know, what's going on globally, and also the more long-term structural imperatives that our economy needs. Yeah, so with all the uncertainty that's grappling in the global markets, yeah, I think in a way the fiscal consolidation is quite interesting and quite welcome. But of course, the devil is in the detail. And yeah, we all know that Malaysia has a pretty limited fiscal space, and I think the other element that has been well noted throughout the day was again Petronas dividends have been halved, and there are many factors to this, but I think global oil prices are definitely the main concern there. So I think that for ideas, the concern remains how we are looking at revenue sources, right? Because obviously there are a lot of demands and spending that the government needs to do, but it's still quite unclear on how our revenue sources are going to be expanded. Yeah, so I think that's one of the main concerns that we've had in the budget so far. Yeah.
Well, everyone wants a piece of the pie of budget every year, and it looks like this year Sabah and Sarawak have received the highest allocation under budget 2026. Do you see this as essentially a closing of the development gap which has been put forth by MA63? So do you see this as a championing of MA63, or are you more, do you think of this as more politically timed ahead of the Sabah state polls?
Yeah, so, well, I think firstly we need to remember that this budget is for 2026, and the Sabah state election is, of course, coming in probably the next 1 or 2 months or so. But I understand your point. However, I think, the pattern of increasing development allocation to Sabah and Sarawak has been going on for the last few years. I believe since 2022, the allocations have increased. So I don't really see like such a dramatic increase this time that might hint to, this being some sort of a pre-election budget or sort of some extraordinary commitment to MA63. I think the increase has been quite steady and in keeping, I think, with the development needs of the two states, which are two very large states, of course. Yeah, so I don't see an extraordinary pattern there. Yeah, but of course, you cannot deny that Sarawak, of course, over the last few years have been more assertive with their own development, the initiatives they've taken. So, of course, not denying that. But no, I do not see an extraordinary pattern or some dramatic increase in this year's budget. Yeah.
Well, did you see in this budget sufficient allocations for strengthening good governance? Now, I'm wondering because the Madani government has long been priming the ground for more difficult structural reforms, for subsidy rationalization and the like. Is there anything in Budget 2026 that suggests that this reform momentum is still alive, or are you seeing there be some it being tempered a little bit by political caution?
Well, there is an increased funding for Parliament from 200 million to 220 million ringgit. Of course, that's always welcome. Parliament's role, as we know, has always need even more strengthening as an oversight body to the executive, and 5 million ringgit allocated to the select committees is also a welcome move, because we know that our PSSCs do need more resources, need more staffing in order to carry out their jobs properly. But I don't really see anything beyond that that stands out very much. Of course, things like the Political Financing Act is still in sort of consultation phase in the different states that's currently being done by Bahayu. So I didn't expect to see much in there. So yeah, the increase in parliamentary allocations, as an allocation for parliament, is a welcome move. And I mean, hopefully this will be translated quite quickly next year in the empowering our parliamentary select committees even further. And, hopefully it will mean that there will also be more public participation, hearings that are open to the public, open to civil society, because this is really important. We can't have these committees operating behind closed doors. But yeah, not so much beyond that. So I don't know if that means it probably doesn't necessarily mean that the government doesn't care about institutional reforms, but maybe they're just taking a little bit more time than expected. Yeah.
Was there anything that was noticeably missing then from this budget that you really wanted to see in it from a governance and a civil society standpoint?
I wouldn't say that from the governance and civil society standpoint, but what we've observed at Ideas was there doesn't seem to be much that stands out in terms of social spending, education and healthcare as well. Of course, the allocation for the ministries will always increase every year, but I think it would have been good to see something more specific and more targeted. So I think in terms of social spending, it seems to be quite thin, I suppose, this year. So that I think was a bit, I guess, a bit of a concern for us observing.
Right. So I may ask you to put your political analyst hat on from a Rakyat perspective. Do you think the public will perceive this budget as responsive to some of the everyday concerns? And we know bread and butter issues will always be at the top of the list of electoral concerns for the public. So do you think that this went far enough to address some of the cost of living concerns that we all face every day?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there has been, there was like 15 billion ringgit allocated for some of the cash handout programs like Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah and the Scheme Asas Rahmah programs. So, those schemes are there. Of course, there is a question of what is the sort of more long-term thinking about cost of living and bread and butter issues. The other thing I wanted to point out was in his speech, I think the finance minister did say something like, subsidies is a right and privilege of Malaysians, which I don't think sends the right message. Firstly, subsidies, terming subsidies as a right and a privilege, I don't think that sends the right message because, as we know, subsidies distort the market and also they cost the government a lot of money that arguably can be used for many other things that the people need. So I think this kind of language, I'm sure, is intentional on the finance minister's part, but I'm a bit concerned on what kind of message this sends to the public. So again, I think in terms of the sort of short-term relief that the Malaysian people need, I think it's kind of pretty standard and they're there. But as we said, the more long-term thinking about this, about how do we raise wages and make living affordable for all Malaysians, the discussion about taxes. So that's, I think, something that was quite thin as well. The increase in tax revenue is, because we're collecting taxes better, not because, we are having comprehensive tax reform across the board. So, so I think in a sort of short-term sense, yes, but I don't think we're doing enough long-term thinking at all. Yeah.
Aira, thank you so much for joining me on the show today and for getting the memo to wear pink on the show. I appreciate you and your time. Thank you. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.